Well, we're excited to be here. We had a really fun conversation amongst ourselves in preparation for today's panel to really kind of try to anticipate and think through some of the topics that would be relevant for all of you, and just also given kind of what's going on in the market right now. So we put some things together, but certainly at the end we can kind of open the floor for a little bit of Q&A too, if there's particular aspects you want to delve into a little bit deeper or some more specific types of questions. So what I'd like to do as I introduce the panel is, given that we do have an audience that's very from a lot of different places and also more kind of academic than industry, I thought I would just allow each of the participants just share a teeny bit about what their firms do, so that you have a sense of who they are and the part of the industry that they represent. So I'll go ahead and kick it off with Leslie Appleton-Young, who is a Vice President Economist with the California Association of Realtors. And if you want to just tell them just briefly about a little bit about what that is, because again, we have people from all over the world in the room, so.
Great. Hi, everybody. Great to be here. Thank you for the invitation, Richard and everyone. So I'm the chief economist with the California Association of Realtors. We are a trade association dedicated to helping our members be more productive and keep them out of jail, basically, is what we try to do. So we try to keep them informed. We have forums. We have a legal hotline. We have 205,000 California realtors in California. Probably half of them are not productive and not really in the business. And in many markets, the top 5 or 10% of the agents do 60 or 70% of the business. So it is a very interesting industry to be a part of. And I am in the group that does the research. We monitor the market. We do a lot of survey research of buyers and sellers and consumers, and we do the number crunching for policy initiatives both in Sacramento and in Washington, because as you may or may not know, California is an outlier most of the time, and so they need a voice to be represented, because when you look at the country as a whole, we're not always represented. So that's kind of what we do.
Right?
Yeah, it's so big.
It's so big. And then next up we have Noah Shore, who is a partner and managing director with Fortress Investment Group. He's based here in Los Angeles. So if you want to just give, again, a little bit about Fortress, be awesome.
Thanks, Mary Lynn. Richard, good to see you. Thanks for having me. Talk a little bit about Fortress Investment Group. It was founded in '99 by Wes Edens, and then Pete Brigger joined in 2001 from Goldman Sachs. And we were, in 2007, the first alternative asset manager to go public. And many have come since we went public: Blackstone, Apollo, a bunch of those guys. And in 2018, we were taken private by SoftBank. We've got two very distinct businesses now. We've had a number of businesses along the way, but today we manage about $45 billion of equity, and two different businesses. We've got a private equity business, which is buying controlling shares in public and private companies, and that's run by Wes. And then we've got our asset-based investing, which is our credit business, and that's run by Pete Brigger. I'm a partner in that business. That's where we house all of our real estate investments. And our real estate investments make up about $10 billion of the $40 billion of equity that we have under management today. We have funds that invest in Asia. They're based in Japan. We've got the funds that we have here are for U.S. and Europe, and we even do some stuff over in Australia. For the most part, we're an opportunistic investor, which means we're taking a little bit of outside risk, trying to hit outsized returns. And I would say that we focus on complicated, complex situations where we are attaching at assets, hopefully below current market prices, and then so we get to them through unique ways. We're not a typical auction buyer, and then through our execution, and we hopefully generate outsized returns for our investors.
And then we also have Jennifer Boss, who is a Senior Vice President, Portfolio Manager with Heitmann. So again, for those of you who aren't familiar with Heitmann and what they do, obviously a huge name here in the States, but yeah.
Yeah, I'm actually an executive vice president.
Oh, executive vice president.
And
well, there
a
you
partner at Heitmann, and I've been there for 25 years. We are a global real estate equity investment firm. We have about 46 billion in assets under management, and I manage 2 separate account portfolios with about 3.6 billion in assets. And the lion's share of our equity is actually in North America, in the US, but we do have funds and separate account businesses in Europe and Asia as well. Our Asian office is in Hong Kong, and our European office is in London, with some smaller offices around Europe. We're big in residential in Europe and have been very successful there with that. We're known for not just our investments in the 4 primary property types: retail, office, warehouse, and residential, but also we're the largest investor historically in self-storage in the US and outside of the REITs. And we invest a lot in medical office and student housing and some of these so-called specialty sectors that have become very popular with investors in recent years.
Okay, well, thank you for introducing your firms and yourselves a little bit more. So I thought what would be a good way to kick things off for the discussion, since I saw that a fair number of presenters in the symposium were looking at some of the residential pieces and mortgages and whatnot, I thought we would first chat about the demographics of what's working its way through mostly the United States, but clearly we see a big trend of that also exhibiting itself in California. In terms of affordability, supply constraints, which I know are affecting markets really all over the world, and seeing how that's kind of playing out. So if we could maybe just kick things off talking a little bit about the impacts for California in terms of where people are migrating, how people are coming in, making location decisions, and then kind of from the residential piece, we can also talk more broadly about some of the commercial aspects too. So Leslie, do you want to kind of kick us off with some of the things that you're seeing here?
Sure. So I'm going to be obviously just talking about the residential sector, and just a couple of things. We have a huge supply issue in California in that we're not building, and I'm sure you've probably caught wind of this, we're not building anywhere near the number of homes that we need. And then on the supply of listing side, baby boomers aren't moving anymore. You know, when I started 30 plus years ago, kind of the rule of thumb is, well, Californians move about every 7 years, and now it's closer to 20. And because of prices and tax structure and lack of supply, many boomers are deciding just to put in that, the stairway little seat that goes up, and their kids move in. I think we're getting to be kind of more like the European feudal model, where people die and they're essentially going to leave their homes to their kids, because it's almost impossible to get into a lot of the coastal metropolitan areas unless you kind of have some kind of a leg up. And when you look at Silicon Valley, I mean, those home purchases, particularly by the young people, they haven't been saving for a down payment. I mean, that's IPO money, right? Because you just can't amass that amount of money on kind of a normal salary. So that's really creating just a huge problem where housing's becoming a luxury good. By 2025, the state of California will be majority renter. Our homeownership rate will be below 50%. And for many of the coastal cities and even the inland cities, we have below 50%, we're majority renter areas. And you mentioned migration, so that's one of the things that we've studied. We spend a lot of time on looking at where people are going with the census data and the American Community Survey data and so on. And what we're finding is there's like this leapfrog effect. You know, the people that are in coastal Southern California go to the Inland Empire, which, if you're not familiar, that's like Riverside, San Bernardino County, and that's kind of our safety valve of affordable housing. but the people that live in Riverside, San Bernardino are getting hit, right, with the rising prices, and they're going out of state. And you're seeing that in the Bay Area as well. The Bay Area people essentially go to Sacramento and San Joaquin counties, and then those people are going out of state as well. So I know Richard talks about this a lot. The net domestic migration is accelerating out of California, even as our population grows. So anyway, I could go on for hours on this, but that's basically the issue. And let me just say one other thing. You know, people talk about how strong the residential real estate market is in California, and I think that's largely because these are people that are coming from the stock, Wall Street, or they're coming from sports, and they're just looking at prices. But when you look at our sales, it is a crisis. Our sales have been essentially flat for 9 years. We have fewer transactions today than when we had 10 million more people living in California. So when I look at the market, I say it's underperforming by 20 to 25% because the transactions, because of affordability, lack of supply, and the tenure in homes, it's just kind of, I don't want to say grinding to a halt, but it's slowing significantly.
So clearly, that has a big impact then on businesses' decisions of locating. It has a big impact on the kinds of people that are residing in California that can afford to move here, the kinds of people that are moving away demographically. I know, Richard, you just spoke about this at our Lusk board meeting the other last week, but it's greatly impacting just affordability across the board for everyone. So whether we're talking about teachers and healthcare givers and all of these different things. So and I assume it is also having a big impact in terms of location decisions for businesses. So we started to kind of talk about that on our call and looking at, where the, big companies are choosing to expand their businesses, whether it's here or, looking at other kinds of markets. So maybe, Jennifer, Noah, maybe you guys could speak to that a little bit of what you're seeing both kind of in this market, but then other markets that seem to be benefiting from some of the things that are happening here.
I'm happy to speak to that a little bit. We look at, in investing in commercial real estate, fundamentals are incredibly important. And job growth and population growth are two of those fundamentals that we look at. You talk about domestic net migration in California is down, but the international migration makes up for that and is up. But the population growth, the job growth, especially around the big metropolitan areas, is as strong as it's been in a long time. And as we look at investing in Silicon Valley and up in the Bay Area, you've got massive companies, right, that are growing. They're building more buildings, they're hiring more people, and those companies are taking up more space. Those employees then are needing places to live. There's people coming in to visit those companies, they're staying in hotels. It's lifted that market tremendously over the last, you can go back 20 years and, minus the Great Recession, it's been pretty phenomenal. And people, and those companies are there for specific reasons. You have talent, and today talent is, for large companies, as important as ever, right? And you've got major institutions up there of knowledge, whether it's Stanford or Berkeley, or that generate that, and you have the like-minded companies. So being close to talent is incredibly important for those type of tenants, and those are the companies that are growing at massive paces today. Those companies have now moved into Southern California in a way that I've never seen since I've been here. Southern California, from an affordability standpoint, I think has always had a problem. Richard would know this better than I would, but Southern California's always been expensive, and but obviously it's getting more, and Northern California's, I think, gotten incredibly expensive. But the fundamentals in Southern California now, we were an entertainment-based economy with a lot of other strong economies around it. But with the content creation that the large technology and or media companies in that disruption that's occurring, that are coming in here to create, because this is the content capital. You have Netflix, Hulu, Google, Apple, Amazon, that are taking up, millions of square feet of real estate and hiring at incredible amounts.
And high
that
salaries.
is lifting, and high salaries, and that is lifting the real estate values around it. I'm not saying all this is good. I mean, with all of this comes the negative backlashes of, it just becomes, you end up pushing a lot of people out. It becomes hard to afford to live here, the traffic issues, so on and so forth. But from a value standpoint and from a investment standpoint, both of these two major markets, Northern California and Southern California, the fundamentals there have been very strong.
So we have not reached a tipping point yet where people say, we're fleeing.
Well, the other part of it, and then I'll let Jennifer talk about it, is when we look at real estate is high barriers to entry, right? So in LA, and especially West LA, if you follow the research firms, Green Street, which is I think one of the better research firms, says that West LA is the highest barrier to entry market in the country today. And so if you have strong fundamentals and high barriers to entry, values end up going up.
Yeah, we agree with all of that. San Francisco, the Bay Area, that's been the number 1 performing office market of this cycle. What we refer to it as a sorting process that's going on in California. So there's been, if you can't operate at a very productive level as an employee here, it will make less and less sense for you. So we see California as this area of the highest talent. It's obviously getting to a breaking point, though, for some tenants. So we are seeing a lot of our Bay Area tenants looking to expand outside of California and making big initiatives. And then you had Macy's.com, for example, decide to pull their whole operation out of San Francisco and relocate to Atlanta, where they're near the Georgia Institute of Technology. So there are also fine institutions other places. So I do think the wealth is starting to get shared more in other markets, places like Austin, the Research Triangle. And I think we'll see more of that because there's just so many limitations. We're still very bullish on San Francisco, and I agree on the LA outlook too. And this new affordable housing ordinance that they might pass in San Francisco will further put a damper on office supply. So they're looking at actually subtracting from Prop M's already pretty tight limitations on office in correspondence with how much affordable housing gets built every year. So those supply constraints, those things that make it great for real estate investors, not maybe great for everybody else, I think are going to continue in California and still make it a good place to invest in commercial real estate as it gets wealthier.
I just want to add, you're absolutely right. I mean, the population is growing, but the people that we're losing are the middle class and the younger people. So that's the concern that I have, not that we're not going to continue to grow. And, we often get questions like, well, the tax structure in California is like so terrible that, my $5 million a year friend is thinking of leaving. But the reality is rich people can afford to live here, and they do live here. And we actually have a net inflow of the high income people into California. It's just the future is leaving. And I think that's kind of a long-term issue, which figures in somewhere, somehow, maybe. I don't know.
Research topic. So Moussa and I are doing work right now looking at the impact of the Tax Cut and Job Act of 2017 on migration from California, because it particularly hit California, New York, New Jersey. We're finding, where's Moussa? Right, we're finding nothing. Zero effect of that on migration.
If you look at it in New York, I bet you would see an incredible amount of migration out.
We do a regression that looks at all metropolitan area pairs, and we're not finding that
even in New York.
Well, it's all metropolitan area pairs, right? And are we seeing changes in movements across pairs based on differences in the SALT deduction?
Right.
And it's not just that it's not statistically significant; it's zero.
It's not there.
We're seeing nothing.
Interesting, because we did a white paper, and we are not, academics or research-based group on the SALT, and we tried to. We're not normally a top-down.
Can you just, for a moment, for the people that don't maybe know what that is, just give a
This
quick
was
little...
the Tax Act that Trump enacted in 2017, which took state and local taxes. When you were used to be able to deduct them from your income, you now got a limit to which you can deduct them, but for the most part, you don't get the benefit. So high income states, income tax states like California, New Jersey, New York, Connecticut.
Maryland and Virginia.
Right, where you used to be able to take that state income tax and deduct it against your federal income tax, you're not able to do so anymore. So you're paying a much higher amount of taxes, and the thought process was that people would leave those states and go to states where you have a much lower, Texas 0, Florida 0, Nevada 0, and we have seen, so we thought that might be, and we tried to look at an investment thesis from top down. Generally, we are, more of a idiosyncratic investor, and depends on the situation. And we thought there would be states that would benefit from that. Now, there are states, it seems, that are benefiting dramatically in that population growth and some of that, and the job growth. I don't know that it's at the expense of other states, but Texas, Florida, Colorado.
Well, Texas, Florida have always been absorbers. So what we're looking at is was there a change in migration behavior after? It's a great natural experiment, right?
Right.
So you basically take this benefit away from some states, and you're absolutely right. In Florida and Texas, it had zero impact, and in fact, and this is not a regression, but in California, the year after passage, out-migration from California to Texas and Florida fell.
Right. Yeah.
So migration happens for a whole lot of reasons, and I think that what we're just finding is the tax lever at the margin is dominated by a bunch of other stuff.
It's so interesting because we are seeing New York. As we look at that market, we think that market is in a free fall right now. In a nightmare scenario in terms of the hospitality industry, from an investment standpoint. We talk about it from an investment standpoint, right? Because that's what we do. I mean, I think there's other ways to look at these markets, but the hospitality, the rent stabilized, multifamily market, the condo for sale market, and certain areas of the office market, and you're seeing at the high end of that market, the extreme high end, the one you said, the 5 to 10 to $20 million people, that makes a big difference. So they can go to Florida, they can spend 5 months a year in New York, and they can save themselves 15% in taxes, right? And you're seeing the residential purchases that are happening in Palm Beach and Boca and stuff today are out of this world. And New York's high-end resi market is, non-existent. So I'm not sure that is hitting at large numbers to where it's affecting, but those big numbers do affect the state budget. And that is going to be that's a big issue, because if you look at the state budget since they've done this, it is affecting them.
Interesting. Jennifer, you kind of talked about a little bit in terms of not necessarily that there's this tipping point. So, you have these businesses that are still, the big names, the media and the tech companies and others that are still growing in terms of kind of, California, Northern California, Southern, but definitely establishing beachheads in some of these areas. So kind of maybe it's not a tale of winners and losers, but maybe a tale of like winners and winners in some way. So can you talk a little bit about that, and then how you guys try to assess that, if some of it's just kind of like a herd mentality, like, yeah, we heard Charlotte's awesome, as opposed to like, what are some of the fundamentals, like, Nashville is just taking off like crazy. Is it just because it's a cool place, or, what's kind of happening that's driving some of those, what used to be more secondary cities into really being seen as, kind of top tier investment opportunities?
Yeah, so investors historically have had a big bias towards gateway markets. And the conventional wisdom was that those are where the most liquidity lies for your assets. Those are the safest places to invest. Investor perception on that has changed dramatically in the last 2 to 3 years. And so I would say the herd is now very much about Sunbelt markets. They're about markets that have tax certainty or lower taxes. That does not include Texas, by the way, which I was mentioning on the phone call. Texas is actually, if you look at our portfolio, that's where our property taxes as a percent of revenue are actually their highest. And I think that surprises people, but it's one of their main sources of revenue is property taxes there, because they are such a low tax state, and we don't generally vote. So it would surprise, so not to say that, but as an example, I have an apartment project in Austin. We had 7% growth in revenue last year. All of that growth but I had 0% NOI growth. And it was all from tax increases, and we're suing every year to try to reduce our taxes, it's very significant. But but definitely sentiment is towards the Sunbelt markets, particularly ones with good education institutes. But one of the surprising ones, I think, that you'd be surprised to hear that's a hot institutional market now is Orlando. Orlando is very hot. It's been one of the top metros for growth year in, year out. And University of Central Florida is one of the largest universities in the country, and they pump out very reliable graduates every year. And so it's not always about the upper echelon students. It's also about that that college educated graduate that's a good deal for the businesses. And businesses actually really like ASU. For that same reason, you'll see like a ton of office development in Tempe, Arizona, all around that labor that's coming out of that school every year.
That's interesting. So I'm going to shift gears a little bit and talk a bit about interest rates, which clearly have effects both at the residential, commercial side of things, but they just keep getting lower. So I'd love to kind of, get your feedback about, we just had another couple of cuts on the interest rates. We're expecting more cuts on interest rates. Makes my brain hurt to think about negative interest rates that are taking place in some places. So I'd love to talk to you and get your perspective about, how do you think that's affecting your kind of businesses, real estate investing in the markets, et cetera, and then, I'll hold off my segue. So yeah, if we can first kind of touch on that, that would be awesome, and really kind of in any order, it doesn't matter.
Okay. I think we believe lower for longer. I think we think that we've all gotten somewhat addicted to these low interest rates, especially on the commercial real estate side. But when you look at the U.S. compared to the world and what's happened over the last 10 years, and I won't have the numbers exactly right, but just ballpark, let's say 10 years ago, 10% of the world was operating on negative rates, right? Today, close to 60% of the world is operating in negative interest rate environments, right? So this is about the world growth, and we've been able to benefit here in the U.S. by, we just talked about some of these cities, whether it was San Francisco, LA, Austin, Orlando, where there's some really strong growth, and generally when you have rate cuts and it's to spur growth, right? And so we've been able to take advantage of borrowing at really low rates, but still getting growth in our properties. So it's been it's what's fueled one of the great 10-year runs of the commercial real estate sector.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and the cap rate compression, has all been part of that. So, and you're saying lower for longer. We had somebody at the board meeting say like lower forever or something. So, who knows? Jennifer, do you want to kind of add on to that a little bit?
Yeah, I don't have much to add except for that every time we think inflation is a risk and that rates are going to start going higher, something happens and it goes the other way. And it is confusing because inflation has been quite low, and I think maybe part of that is the global labor force that we have today and the flexibility with that labor force, and that has been a big constraint on wages. But there are areas of high inflation in our economy, right? Services. Services inflation has been actually pretty significant. Construction costs have been growing 4 to 6% a year each year over this cycle. So there's a big spread in inflationary trend. There's no doubt that the price of goods just keeps going down every year, and that's been a big constraint on things. And just all the capacity that we have in the global production system. But on a leveraged yield basis, although yields have been coming down, for sectors like real estate where we borrow our leverage yields have been very attractive this whole cycle, and then add to that, we're seeing growth. So, I just closed on an industrial deal where and that's a very expensive sector, low cap rates, and I'm getting a predicted 7% cash flow yield on that with pretty modest leverage. So
it saves the day.
Yeah.
Against these kind of really tight pricings.
Yeah.
And as far as kind of, residential, Leslie, I know obviously refinancings are huge going on right now and really kind of carrying the day as far as, residential transactions. But, are we going to see that it kind of continues to deal with prices, or is it not really that big of an increment? How is it affecting
it's first of all, it's really too soon to tell, but when rates started to come down last year, there was a lag of a couple months where the market didn't really change very much, and we're like, gee, what's happening to that lever? And then all of a sudden the high end of the market came back like gangbusters, particularly in the fourth quarter of last year, and we started to see price appreciation go from 3% year over year to 6 or 7% year over year. So it was like the party was back on again. And so low rates are, typically always good for housing. I think the question is what else is going on? And Redfin, which is a kind of a tech-focused brokerage with salaried agents, and it's a very interesting model with a very smart CEO. They came out with a report yesterday that said the prior 2 days, they had noticed a significant drop-off in showings and interest on the part of buyers in Seattle. And I know we're going to talk about the virus later in the program, but those are the kind of things that are going to maybe work against kind of the low rate situation. And then just in terms of the velocity of real estate transactions, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, we've been kind of stuck in this narrow band between 400 and 415,000 transactions for the last 8 or 9 years because of other factors. It's not because of rates as much as it's because of supply. So that's really the implication of boomers aren't moving. Why aren't boomers moving? It doesn't pencil out. Why would I give up this low property tax rate and put myself in a situation where I'm competing for a condo downtown with all these millennials? Because there's nowhere to go if I want to stay in my area. The lust for tax revenues is looking at Prop 13 and essentially saying, why are different property types taxed the same way? And shouldn't commercial be taxed at a higher rate or reassessed more often? And there are loopholes that are vigorously taken advantage of in terms of a property will change hands, but there won't really be a transaction change and a reassessment because it's a stock transfer instead of a building transfer. So just like in anything, if there's an opportunity to exploit and profit or avoid a tax, people will do that. But the people running the schools in California are looking for more money. And looking at a split roll has come up many, many times. And the organization that I work for is very opposed to any change in split roll 100%. I think it's polling positively, though, if I'm right, that the polls of the population, voter population in California, it's polling more positive than negative. Is that right, Richard? I can't. I haven't looked at it for a while. It's pretty even, which is kind of a surprise.
It was polling more positive.
A surprise to me. So yeah, but beware of unintended consequences. It's just like rent control. I guarantee you that rent increases are going to be higher under rent control than they were before rent control. It is not a way to attack that problem. But people look at things very simplistically, unfortunately. So
we don't really, we're a very short-term holder. We hold properties from 3 to 7 years. So the idea of the split roll on commercial doesn't affect us as much, other than probably makes the market more competitive. It probably provides more opportunities. And then for someone like Jennifer who just bought an industrial portfolio, right? That will level the market a little bit. You got somebody that's owned an industrial building for 30 years and is paying almost no taxes on it. He's able to offer a much lower rent than she is and get the same yield. So it'll level that out. But the thing that I'm worried about, because we don't really have a dog in this fight, is we just talked about the SALT deductions. We talked about this being a high tax state and the potential for migration out. When you look at companies that are here, that own huge amounts of real estate, that have owned them for a while, Disneyland, okay? I mean, they're not gonna move that, but you've got companies like Cisco up in the Bay Area that own, 50 million square feet, and they've owned it for 30 years. And if the split roll, you're gonna push companies to go other places, and you're gonna lose jobs, and there's unintended consequences that will come as a result of it. There are some positives that will come out of it, but there are a lot of,
Plus, this isn't a one-time reassessment. It's every 3 years the commercial property gets reassessed, and this one proposal.
So I did want to talk about kind of this idea of, this wall of capital, but we've got, again, in real estate, 2018, 2019, huge capital funds being raised for real estate, the headlines, Blackstone and all of these great funds. And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on how is that affecting maybe some of your decisions? How is it affecting your business? What are you kind of seeing on the ground? We talked about kind of some of these secondary cities that are being viewed as gateways. Is it partially because there's just so much money out there, chasing deals? So if we can talk a little bit about kind of that near term and potentially longer term horizon on that would be helpful.
I think like something close to 70% of the dry powder, so to speak, that's out there is all aimed in the value add and opportunistic space. So it has made that part of the market incredibly competitive. And then I think the number 3 category of dry powder is debt. So debt funds like ours, others have all done extremely well. And I think part of that is driven by low interest rates. So typically those debt funds lend money to a pretty high percentage of the capital stack, depending on the fund, and then they might borrow some of that money that they're lending, and so you get kind of an amplified effect on your returns. And so investors have responded very positively to those returns that they offer. They like that they're in the first loss, or not in the first loss position, so to speak. And then if you look at core, which I think there's a perception out there that real estate's very expensive, and that there's all these core investors out there bidding up assets. That's actually a kind of a distressed area of real estate outside of industrial. The core funds aren't raising that much money. The Odyssey funds, as they're called, these core funds, are seen as overvalued, particularly their retail assets, but really across the board.
Is that partly because there isn't a lot of distressed property out there to buy?
Core funds don't buy distress.
They buy safe assets.
But what did you just say earlier? Something about distressed?
Oh, that the funds itself are considered distressed because
I'm sorry.
Yeah,
okay,
yeah.
got it.
And they're so the core space is actually pretty stagnant outside of the industrial sector, which is very much in favor. And my favorite area of investing this whole cycle has been core plus. So we call this cycle the barbell cycle. So there's been a ton of money for value add until recently. There has been a lot of money for uber core when the Odyssey funds were raising a lot of money, and then there's this huge in between space of stuff, and there literally will be 1 or 2 bidders, if that. People take things off the market all the time, try to sell them, can't sell them, and so if you go in and buy assets that are super desirable in investors' eyes, but are still solid assets, and you put some leverage on, you can get a very good risk-adjusted return. And that's probably that's actually the category where there's the least amount of money, other than the debt funds going in and financing those kind of assets.
So do you think then the prices have kind of gotten inflated, or at that edge of where you can get any kind of real return then at the core piece and the core plus, and so you're saying kind of that in between is?
I'm not making a judgment on whether it is or isn't overpriced, because there's capital market context and yields are very low. But on a risk-adjusted basis, I see that core plus space as one of the more attractive because the value funds are having, and the opportunistic funds are having to do, they're having to take a lot of risk to make these returns, because the returns that they're promising their investors are very high.
What do those kind of generally look like?
I'll let
just
Noah
to kind of give everybody
on the
here a
opportunistic
sense.
side?
Yeah, I mean,
The
because
opportunistic side, I think our investors, we're telling them we're shooting for 18 to 20 gross kind of returns, and our net returns are in that 14 to 16% range. I tend to agree. I think this is one of the hardest times to invest in real estate. I think prices are high, and we are in a later stage of a cycle. I don't know how long it goes, but you're in a later stage of a cycle. There is a ton of capital looking at assets, but it's not every asset has big pools of buyers behind them. So you really have to think about, as someone that buys and then sells, how you get out of these assets. I like to follow Blackstone. I just think they do this in a way that is, if you just see where they've invested over the last number of years, in a way that they just get it. So they went in to Core Plus 5 years ago. Majority of the money they raised, the majority they were putting out was Core Plus. They'd go into San Francisco. They didn't have to buy the 4 cap building. They'd go buy the 5.5 cap building or 6 cap building that was 80% occupied, take it to 90, put 70% leverage on it at 3%, and they were getting themselves 10, 11, 12%, levered returns, which I thought was a great risk-adjusted return compared to my buying a vacant building and trying to lease it up and do a bunch of work to it and try to get a 18 that turns into a 15.
Yeah, I did buy industrial building. I just thought is a Blackstone market that they are going into big time, and I'm like, okay, I'll buy my little building draft off of Blackstone. Same thing.
And now they've got their non-traded REIT, which is raising money faster than anything's ever been raised. In the month of January, they raised $2 billion alone.
And that was a dead industry.
And this is just targeting cash flowing assets that are not your shiny top assets, but then they can invest in all different markets, which makes markets like, everybody's in Austin today already, so you don't need Blackstone to go in there to tell you, but they can go into good secondary markets and buy the best assets at 100, 200 basis points wide of what they would be buying in a gateway market and borrow at the same price, right? So it's pretty interesting.
Yeah, very interesting.
So I just will add something that, institutional ownership of residential units has increased a lot, and these guys were very smart after the meltdown and came in, and they were buying properties in the Central Valley for less than replacement costs back in 2008 and 2009. And when I say that the homeownership rate in California will dip below 50% next year, part of that is there's a lot of rental property going on, and partly it's because people can't afford to buy, and partly it's because you have so much cash and rates are so low and there just aren't a lot of opportunities for yield. And I think the price curve is played out, not totally, but most of it has. But what we find is that right now people aren't flipping as much as they're holding on, just because it's a good asset. And I think the social implications of this are really important, because homeownership is the number one way that a middle-class family earns wealth over their lifetime. And I know we talked about the buy-rent analysis, and you can do a buy-rent analysis till you're blue in the face and it's cheaper to rent, but people that rent don't save money. They don't save the money and reinvest it the way these models say. It's like homeownership is where all of that happens. And to have these opportunities really slipping away dramatically, particularly in the California markets that I study, I think is a real concern for society going forward. We are really becoming a bifurcated state where there's a lot of wealthy people are doing a lot better, and homeowners that have been in their homes a long time, and they don't see their low taxes as a subsidy, right? I'm entitled to that. That's mine. But for the people that can't get in, they're either, it's higher density, it's renting, or it's leaving the state altogether. And for good or for ill, I don't think there's any way to stop this. The increasing the supply of housing was one of the top priorities of the governor, but there was no way to meet. I think it was 3.5 million over 5 years. I mean, there was like no way to get anywhere near that. So it's not going to happen. And I just think you're going to see an acceleration of this leveling of the playing field that you talked about with people moving to other states, because I think that's really the wake-up call for Californians. There's a lot of other nice places to live in the country where you can actually buy a home and raise a family, and okay, the weather's not as great, but you know what? I'm going to make it work.
I
So
loved your term of the sorting.
Yeah.
I think that's a great way, especially when we think about like agglomeration economies and all that kind of stuff. We think about this sorting of like who can kind of benefit from this in terms of productivity and wages, and then who maybe is not. That really plays into
I
that.
think
So.
you bring up the inequality gap. I think it's probably one of the bigger things we're going to have to address as a society, and we got to start addressing it, today. I think it's affecting us everywhere. I moved here 13 years ago, and I'd walk to my office building, and you never saw the kind of homeless that you see today or the other issues. And I don't care what piece of property I'm looking at today. I mean, there is homeless everywhere. That's right. We've got all sorts of other issues on the education side. And I would ask Richard, because I'm not smart enough about this, but we've talked in ULI and other things about super zip codes. And you talk about people moving out of here. I talk about the people that have money want to congregate around other people that have that money and in areas where it's enjoyable. The west side of LA is about as nice a place to live as I've been, and you have people with money going there. That doesn't mean that the society works well long term, because then what we need is the rest of it to work. But how are these super zip codes affecting everything?
Well, it is. I mean, it's the point. So the other reason I don't think taxes matter is if you look at migration in California, there is in-migration of rich people. It's everybody else who's moving out. So if it were taxes, and actually, low-income people in California pay pretty low taxes here because we have a steep and progressive tax system here. The median taxpayer in California actually pays below what the median state taxpayer pays nationally. Does that make sense? So you look at somebody who makes $60K a year, which is the median income in California, they're paying less taxes than their counterpart is in more states than us. Well, no, not there's like Florida, nobody pays taxes. And it shows when you go to Florida, you can tell. Nobody pays taxes. But they're the ones moving out, and it's rich people who pay very high taxes who are moving in. And it is, I mean, this is Moretti's stuff. New geography of job stuff is clustering really matters. And if you're a software engineer in Cleveland and you move to the Bay Area, you know what? Your wages go up by more than the incremental cost of your housing. And so you're willing to bid for that housing in order to be there. But everybody else who doesn't have that opportunity, who can't make that match, as to Jennifer's point, it's like, well, the wages don't go up very much. The next smart person moving into California actually does push up wages of less skilled people a little bit, but not enough to compensate for what they do in the housing market. And so they're leaving for, Leslie, to your point, what's interesting now, in 2008, when it was the recession, people were leaving for Texas. That's happening a lot less now. Where they're leaving for is Phoenix and Las Vegas, which is suggests to me that there's something about, you do want to be close to your friends and family. You don't want to be 1,500 miles away, but you just can't afford to live here. And that job that pays 10K less in Phoenix, you still have a much better standard of living in Phoenix.
One of the more jarring things we see in California and other expensive Western states is, us owning self-storage. We have a lot of homeless people trying illegally to live in our self-storage, which I think says a lot about a lot of things, but housing regulations and things like that. But it's you have climate-controlled self-storage that wealthy people are able to afford for their junk, right? And then you have these homeless people who are dying to spend the night in these self-storage units. In very significant numbers, and it's that alone. There's way too much self-storage probably in California, and not enough housing at all. So it's an interesting trend that happens.
At some point we'll get into a time thing, and I would be remiss if I didn't bring up the coronavirus, because we're all kind of living it. It's having impacts. We're about to have impacts, we think, in terms of, what the potential supply chain, and we're seeing it already kind of affecting hotel and travel and other pieces. I always tell my students, hotels, are kind of that canary in the coal mine, right? So we're kind of already seeing some of the effects of that there. So let's talk just a little bit in terms of, any thoughts your firms might be, considering some of the different impacts or shifting their projections. I saw, I think it was BlackRock that had said, that they were going from like a growth mentality to more stability. So they were kind of making some shifts in terms of their predictions already as far as it's happening. So we don't want to be overly panicked, but also, it's real. It's slowing the economy. We could have some other issues. So maybe you guys could just talk about, I know your firms might have even, was it Jennifer, your firm published something that said?
Yeah, I think you guys are calling it a 2-year recession.
I don't want to call that the firm's calling that, but one of the founders and a lot of the top partners are very, very nervous about it. I got an email before I walked in here about an all hands on deck call tomorrow morning. They see this as pushing us into a recession. Nobody's got a crystal ball, but some of the things we're seeing and some of the slowdown that we're starting to see is very scary.
So let's just kind of, for the group, kind of talk about, so what are some of the things we're starting to see? Clearly, like decrease in, occupancy at hotels and some of those kinds of things. But
just a couple examples. So we own an outlet center that's halfway between LA and Las Vegas. It's the natural stopping point between LA and Las Vegas. 50 to 60% of our business is bus traffic. So you get a lot of Asian tourists that fly in here. They get on a bus at LAX. It takes them to Disneyland. It may take them to, depending on the bus, it takes them all different places, and then it goes to Vegas. And halfway between LA and Vegas, they go off, they get the bathroom, and they shop, right? And they're good shoppers. So our bus traffic was down 35% the last 2 weeks. On the hospitality side, I just read Green Street's put something out this morning on the hospitality market. It's hard when you're looking in the rearview mirror and you're not getting that information so quickly. So up until the end of February, you weren't seeing a huge impact, but they started to see it, in the last few days, and they're calling for, if you look at what happened in post 9/11, the two biggest issues or events that have affected the hospitality business in the last 20, 30 years is 9/11, which we had from kind of a peak to trough around 38%, and then the Great Recession, which was about 36, 37% on the hospitality. But then we've had things like Ebola, which you had almost nothing, right? So not sure where it plays out, but it feels like RevPAR is going to be down in this next quarter, 7 to 10%, because of this.
Yeah. And the amount of, everybody seems very eager and quick to cancel business travel, and then a little bit slower to cancel their own personal travel. It was interesting. But in Chicago, we've already had 2 enormous events at McCormick Place, our convention center, canceled this month, and a whole host of just little real estate conferences canceled in just the last week. So we're seeing, especially on the business travel side, just wide scale cancellations. Anybody who was very dependent on the Asian consumer, the Chinese consumer, they've already seen the impact coming through in the last month. It'll be an interesting shock, because there's the supply side of it too. So
That's
it's not just a demand shock; it's a supply shock. And so I think the GFC really uncovered a lot of structural issues with the economy that needed to be fixed. I don't think that this is that kind of recession, but there was a supply chain overdependence on China, and so it is bringing up some issues like can we produce antibiotics without China? There's a lot of important medicine and things like that and some companies like Apple that were entirely dependent upon China. And I do think all of that will be rethought and reconfigured after this.
And there might be some issues in the meantime. Richard, you had mentioned that in kind of our conversations last week, but some of the just, widgets that are needed that are, kind of held up and can't make it back into different aspects of our manufacturing process, or don't make it to some other location to then create the finished good that then gets sold. So it should have impacts through retail and industrial in a lot of parts of our business. Did you want to add anything?
Well, yes,
to
the
that?
Deutsche Bank had a cool number, which is that 20% of U.S. manufacturing is touched by China at some point. Now, that's not that 20% of the parts are Chinese, but the point is, in a supply chain, even if it's a special screw for the product, if you don't have that special screw, which has a specific die for making that screw, you can't just go to Mexico or Vietnam and get that screw. And so your entire supply chain is shut down as a result of that. It's the touch point, not the value added. That's the right way to look at it. I thought it was this guy, Torsten Slock at Deutsche Bank, that puts out really great sort of, in time, I think, real-time stuff. And so you think about 20% of U.S. manufacturing being vulnerable, that's a lot.
Yeah, when we look at, again, those goods and movement of goods through whatever it is, right? Our ports, the industrial, working its way through our consumer economy, everything. So hard to pinpoint what that dollar looks like.
There was a piece this morning in the Wall Street about Mexican produce rotting on docks because they can't, just put it on ships and send it here.